I know there are a lot of questions that we had as an organization and how what impact some of these things have with us, with our itinerant staff and what have you. And we knew that districts probably have many of the same questions. And so thank you for joining us and walking us through what you know at the moment.
Right. Yeah, right. That's what I was just going to say. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to share, and I'm happy to have this time to talk with all of you. One caveat in sharing the PowerPoint and recording is, as you all know, this has been such a changing situation. I have been literally in the middle of giving somebody guidance on something when a new document comes out and new guidance comes out, and I have to shift my guidance and start over in some instances, but also kind of tweak it. So keep in mind, even though this may be shared and this is recorded, it is current and in sort of the best guidance we can provide as of today. But you are going to want to continue to monitor, and I'll continue to the best of my ability to provide CESA some updates, and Dan and Tracy if additional information comes out. So today, just really quickly, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. I'm hopefully going to answer some of the biggest questions that you have. I'm not going to be able to answer all of them because I still have a lot of questions, and I know that my team still has a lot of questions, and others in the legal community, because we've been talking, and there are a number of different issues that we're still waiting on guidance from OSEP or DPI. And so just know that additional questions will remain, but I will really kind of do my best to try to answer them. And what I have been doing and what we have all been doing is monitoring the information, but also kind of going back to sort of the basic tenets of the law in terms of IDEA and 504, and keeping in mind, okay, while we may not have a specific answer to this question, does the way that we're going to proceed, does the next step, does it sort of fit within the intent of the law and the spirit of the law? And I think at some point, really that is the best, kind of the best gauge is, does this really feel like it meets the intent of IDEA? Considering that we're never going to meet all the procedural requirements in the light of what's going on, but really are we doing our best to sort of meet the spirit and intent of it? So I kind of keep coming back to that, as you'll see in the webinar too. We're going to talk about some kind of key areas in terms of special ed and how to provide it in light of all that's going on. I appreciated the questions I got. I know Barb Buffington sent me a number of questions and issues. Tracy had sent me some questions and some areas and others as well. So I do appreciate that. And hopefully I've tried to incorporate them, and hopefully I've answered them in there. We're going to talk just kind of basically about school closing and FAPE, virtual instruction, which a lot of districts are going to now, IEP meetings, prior written notice. And if you've not used prior written notice before, I will say lessons learned, this is the time to use it. Provisions of special education and related aids and services when you're talking about a virtual environment, timelines and other issues that I have raised in here. We will provide you, or I'll try to provide you and my team, the next steps until the guidance changes, of course. But the biggest, the takeaway I would say from this is make a good faith effort in providing services, in kind of approaching this and addressing these issues. And if necessary, like always, just try again and keep tweaking and monitoring situations. You aren't going to get it all right. I don't know that anybody's going to get it all right. It's like the lottery a little bit in terms of you're trying to guess how you would move forward. But I did have, and you'll see it in the webinar here, I did have kind of a moment last night, which I was thankful for. Unfortunately, it came at about 1:30 a.m. when I was listening to one of the webinars that OSEP did. It was a question and answer session with the state or the national organizations. And when I listened to it, and it was choppy and there was lots of interruptions, I did really get a sense that everybody is sort of on the same page, and that OSEP, and I hope DPI follows suit, because I haven't seen this coming out of DPI, but certainly OSEP, which is the federal agency that is responsible for enforcing IDEA. OSEP really is looking at this from a very practical perspective and recognizing that This situation is unprecedented. Schools and OSEP and state agencies are all trying to figure out how to handle this, what to do. It's changing day to day. Schools across the nation are closing now. Obviously in Wisconsin, the closure is indefinite. So it really is a situation that nobody has specific answers to, but there was a sense of try to go back to those basics of IDEA and 504 and to help students and see what you can do to provide services to help them progress toward their goals in their IEPs and through the curriculum. And that was a theme that I heard over and over again in that webinar. I do have a site to it. The resources I put together, at least the ones I have found most helpful to date. The questions and answers on providing services to children with disabilities, obviously that came out from the Department of Education last week. That second bullet point is the link to the webinar that I was talking about. And that really, if you can make it through it, and I would encourage you to start a little earlier than midnight, but if you can make it through it, I would say it really does have some helpful question and answers in there. The fact sheet on COVD, on COVID-19, that is in that third bullet point, or that second big bullet point, the K through 12 school closure FAQs from DPI, and then the Office for Civil Rights also put out both a very short webinar and also a fact sheet on issues. The OCR guidance has some more specific kind of guidance with respect to timelines that OSEP said it was still working on, so that may be changed. But the one thing I found helpful about the OCR materials and the fact sheet is that as you're looking at this and you're determining services and you're determining what to provide to students, that concept of equal access to materials and instruction and how do you do that is kind of driving the ship here in terms of instruction. So as far as services when schools are closed, I'm going to just put my thing down here so I can see these. The basic rule, if a school district closes and the district isn't providing any educational services to the general student population, you are not required to provide services to the students with disabilities during that same period of time. So the question being, if our school district is off for the next 3 weeks, we are not providing any services to our regular ed students, do we have an obligation to provide them to our special ed students? And the answer is no. If you are providing educational services to the general ed population, most of the districts that I work with are providing some amount of virtual instruction or virtual program. You have to ensure that a student with disabilities has equal access to the same opportunities. So having the ability to access those educational services and materials, and to the provision of FAPE, and to ensure, and this is the language that comes from DPI and OSEP, to the greatest extent possible, that a student can be provided with special education and related aids and services in the IEP or Section 504 plan. Certainly, to the greatest extent possible, that's the big question, right? Is how do you do that, particularly with students who have significant needs, students where virtual instruction doesn't offer them the ability to access much. So how do you do that and still meet that? And we'll talk about that with those students. When you are talking about providing services to students, what has to be provided? It's the $1 million question. And I don't know that there is any absolute specific guidance on this. In fact, if there is, I've not found it. And I will tell you that I have dug and dug. In terms of a sort of a checklist of what has to be provided, again, there isn't one. But I will tell you what I found was incredibly helpful last night in that OSEP webinar, was that OSEP, the Lori from OSEP specifically stated that they are not looking at whether a district is meeting specific minutes in terms of an IEP, but instead looking at whether that student can continue to progress toward their IEP goals and curriculum. You know, as we have been looking at all of these issues and trying to figure out, especially from a special ed perspective, the questions have arisen of how do you do this when you have a student who's in perhaps a full-time pullout and they have a one-to-one aide and they are receiving direct instruction all day. How do you meet those minutes in a virtual instruction scenario? And I know a lot of the questions that were sent to me were things like parents who are saying, how are you going to provide somebody to help my student get through this because they can't do this on their own? The key, at least as what I have heard from OSEP to date, and as I said, I haven't heard this from DPI. I'm hoping this is DPI's perspective, is that it isn't so much about meeting specific minutes. It's with the situation that is going on, what can you provide to a student to help them continue to progress toward those goals and through the curriculum? If you have alternate methods of instruction, OSEP talked about virtual instruction, telephone instruction, phone calls to students. If parents don't have access to the internet, phone calls to them to walk them through instruction, to talk with them, to check in. Curriculum-based instructional activities, and even parent consultation, consulting with the parent to say, here's what you can do over the next few days with your student. If alternate methods of instruction are sort of meeting the intent of the IEP, you're providing instruction, you're helping them move toward at least some goals and move toward the curriculum, then OSEP stated you are meeting the letter of the law. I will say, in the webinar, as you'll see, there were a lot of questions that were deflected in terms of specifics. OSEP isn't willing to say, look, if you provide 25% of the services you have in your IEP, we will consider that good. In fact, somebody actually asked that. They said, can you kind of give us a standard which we should shoot for in terms of school districts? And OSEP said, no, we're not going to do that. We are going to say, look and determine what you can provide. Can services sort of meet the intent of the IEP? You are meeting the letter of the law. One of the questions was, what if we're sending home a packet of homework? Is that providing FAPE? Again, OSEP didn't answer it, Lori didn't answer it, but said, FAPE is based on the individual needs of the student. Stressed that over and over and over, all individual situations. But if a student can complete those activities without assistance or with assistance by providing a couple times a week a check-in or a work time within EA virtually, and can continue to progress through the curriculum and at least move toward their IEP goals, that may be enough. There was a sense of, we recognize this situation and how difficult it is and how these restrictions are that are being put in place are making it really, really difficult to provide services. So we recognize we have to be flexible in all of this. DPI and OSEP explain some services may not be able to be delivered during a period of closure and in an online format. Social skill goals or instruction may be difficult. Implementing a specific physical therapy, occupational therapy intervention, and I know there are rules with regard to telephysical therapy and restrictions. Those things may be impossible online or certainly at another location, and there's no obligation for you as districts to provide those services at home. In fact, let me say this. I think face-to-face services at this time are both compromise staff and student safety, raise issues in terms of liability and under your insurance policies. And when you talk about services that are provided at off-district placements that might be considered schools, I think those are prohibited under the governor's orders in terms of instruction at private schools. So the idea in terms of there are going to be decisions that you make that you cannot provide certain services, and so what do? OSEP, DPI, going back over and over and over again, saying in those instances, once school resumes, your IEP teams are likely going to have to determine what, if any, compensatory education services are necessary to make up for those lack of services during the closure. We're going to talk more about that determination and the compensatory services, but essentially the fallback position of both OSEP, OCR, in their guidance, and DPI has been very consistent in that if you cannot provide services, that those lack of services will just have to be addressed once school resumes and you look at it from a compensatory education perspective. While that gives me comfort in terms of the immediate provision of services, it also makes my heart stop a little bit in terms of as I sit and think through when school resumes. Say, for example, school doesn't resume for the rest of the year. And I think we all know that is a very possible scenario. But when it resumes at some point in this year yet, or at the beginning of next year, the idea of trying to figure out what comp ed services are needed for students, I think is daunting. And the possibility of disagreement between parents and IEP teams, the possibility of litigation, administrative litigation, idea complaints. I hope that there are some more specific standards and guidance that come out between now and then, so that perhaps that process can be streamlined, and perhaps it will do something to at least stave off future litigation and all of this. One of the questions that I have been asked a lot, and my guidance has changed from last night when I listened to this webinar to yesterday afternoon, as a couple of my clients who are on listening will recognize, do you have to have IEP meetings now if you're going to go to virtual instruction? Specifically was a question that was asked on that webinar. If a district is providing educational services via virtual instruction to all students in the district, is an IEP meeting necessary for every student in special education prior to that virtual instruction? And OSEP stated no. They said if a district's going to move forward with instruction for all students, virtual instruction for all students, an IEP team meeting is not required. It may be required, and frankly, it is likely to be required once school resumes. That said, I think that's the overall principle, is what OSEP is stating as, yeah, we see you out there. We know there are districts that have, in the hundreds of students who have IEPs. Are we expecting you to immediately convene virtually every IEP team for all of those students by the time virtual instruction starts? The answer is no. I would tell you that in terms of best practice, it may be best practice for districts to convene IEP meetings of students with the most significant disabilities, to discuss and be very clear with parents how and what services are going to be provided to those students. I think this is a fluid process also. The services that are available now and what you can provide to students now, I'm guessing 2 months from now, if this is continuing, you may have access to a lot more online content, curriculum, and services through different companies. And so I think that potentially could change. But I think you may want to really consider looking and kind of prioritizing those students that you're going to have to really sit down and think about, how do we provide any services to them, and can we, and how are we going to do it, and what can we do? My advice would be, at this point, I wouldn't be revising the IEP itself at this point. I would be including and sending to parents following that a prior written notice that states, the governor has ordered school closures. This is the guidance that has come out. Our school is closed. We are providing virtual instruction. This is what we talked about, and this is what services we're going to be able to provide and how we're going to provide them. And I would be sending those to parents. We are working on a template for notice of that, a prior written notice for that. And I'm certainly will be sharing it with our clients. But in terms of going kind of through the list and looking, how are you going to provide services, and particularly for those students that it's not going to be easy, what can you provide? So that the prior written notice, whether you hold an IEP meeting, and my next point, which isn't on here, is I would provide also to your other special ed students, even if you don't have a meeting, I would provide notice to those parents what you're providing, what you're not going to be able to provide, the timeline for implementation, the process, what is available to those students in terms of IT assistance. the communication between districts and families with students with disabilities, I think, is absolutely essential right now. Providing that communication and documenting what you are providing and not providing for that student is key, because here's what I will say. I can't imagine how hard coming back when school resumes to determine what compensatory education services, how difficult that's going to be. It will be made unbelievably more difficult if you have not documented well what has been provided to that student, what hasn't been provided to that student. You want to document that information so that's clear and you can look at that and determine what may need to be provided once school resumes. IEP teams, they are not required to meet in person while schools are closed. And in fact, I would certainly say I wouldn't be doing that. You can hold your IEP teams virtually and through a Zoom session. You can hold them over the phone. If parents don't have access to computers or the internet, but they have access to phones, I think you certainly can provide it in that fashion.
So Tess, we do have just a couple questions that popped in related to what you're saying. So one of the questions was, is there a timeline for when that template might be done?
Hopefully in the next day or two. Yep.
Okay.
We're working on it.
And then you just got done talking about holding online IEP meetings like through Zoom or Google Meet or something like that. Are there any concerns around FERPA or HIPAA around doing that?
I mean, I would say in terms of holding the IEP meetings as far as FERPA and or HIPAA, I mean, I think IEP meetings are held all the time virtually via phone with parents who can't come in. I mean, it has always been an option. I would say that as long as you confirm, even at the beginning of the meeting, that individuals are in a spot where confidentiality is protected, student confidentiality is protected, I would just confirm that at the beginning of the meeting. I think you can hold the meetings that way. One of the things that may be, and that's a good question that comes up, and it's the first time I'm thinking about it in terms of an IEP meeting. I actually would suggest that prior to holding the meeting, you get consent from the parent to hold the meeting virtually or via phone with individuals in different locations. And that parents consent to that and consent to sharing information about the student in that manner. So I think that's actually a really good point in terms of prior to the meeting, I would be seeking, I think it would be a really good practice to be seeking consent from the parent to do that. And so that you can share that information electronically, whether it's by phone or whether it's by Skype or whether it's by Zoom. Hopefully
so
that
connected
answers the question.
Yeah, one of the questions is that their IEP software has an M1 form for prior written notice. Mm-hmm. Is that form different from the template that you're talking about?
Yeah, so that's another good question. The M1 form is the form that says you send out to parents when you are rejecting a request or not providing something to the parent. The M1 form has never been something that I've been a fan of. I don't think it meets the criteria of prior written notice in general. Sometimes what I will suggest is that districts can use the M1 form, but then attach to the back of it sort of a narrative of what they are considering, what they are providing, why they can't provide these services, why they've rejected a request. The template that certainly that I would be proposing and that I do use with my districts, I don't even use the M1 for a prior written notice. We essentially use a letter that usually attached to the back of the IEP that says this notice is being provided to you in accordance with the statutes, and we cite the statutes, include in there the information that was considered by the team, what options were considered, what was rejected, the basis for those assessments, and meeting the criteria of prior written notice. The template also has in their information that they have procedural due process rights and information in there that they can contact low-income services, legal services for purposes of their special education. And I think it has a statement in there about disability rights. They can contact disability rights. So It does look different, Dan, and to those of you out there, I don't think M1 provides sort of the framework in terms of what I like to have clients provide to parents in terms of a prior written notice. Here's what I will say. DPI will accept the M1 as a prior written notice. If you provide that, if you include the information on there, they will absolutely conclude that that meets the requirements, as long as there's information, enough information on there as to what the team has considered and rejected, and why they have taken the action that they are taking. Going back to that, it goes back to also, if you all know, on that P2 page of the IEP, so the P2 placement page, it's always been one of those things that makes me crazy, is on that P2 page where it says other options the team considered and rejected, and then there's a box to check none. And I always say, I don't think there's ever an occasion where I would check none. I mean, you are required to provide to parents prior written notice when you change their placement, when you reject a request, all the different identify, evaluate services and placement. I would always be providing reasons and basis for whatever the team's decisions are in that P2 page as well, if you're not going to provide a separate prior written notice. But to kind of go back, just so that it's very clear, while you aren't required, at least OSEP is stating, to hold an IEP meeting, I would say a couple of steps follow that. I think you may really want to consider prioritizing those students that you think it's almost impossible to try to figure out and communicate what services you're going to provide and determine what parents have at home, what options are available, without convening the team. So I think I might consider convening the team of those students who have the most significant disabilities to discuss how those services are going to be provided and what's going to be provided. In terms of other students that you think those students will be able to progress because they only receive 30 minutes of speech a week and we can provide telespeech to them, or other students who may have 20 minutes of check-in with the resource teacher to organize homework and assignments and things. If you aren't going to hold a meeting, I would also, for both those that you hold a meeting for and those that you don't, I would provide a prior written notice essentially, or at least some other communication to those parents, specifically documenting the services that'll be provided, the timelines, the process, and the offer of assistance if they're going to need assistance in terms of accessing technology or getting on to virtual programs. As I said, I think the key really is to be communicating with parents and letting them know how this is going to be rolled out for their student. And it does go back to what OSEP's statement was over and over again in that webinar, and I know even with DPI on their site is, which is the services provided to the greatest extent possible really should be based on the individual needs of the student. And so in an effort to at least begin that process, and I know that's daunting in some districts because there are hundreds of IEPs, but in order to begin that process, to be looking at the IEPs and prioritizing perhaps when meetings are necessary and how you're going to roll it out so that you're communicating the necessary information to those families.
Tess, this is Tracy. We have some questions. So far, you've been talking about what happens if your school is actually providing virtual services. In the case where schools have been closed and schools are just shut down, but now we've got annual meetings coming up and we know IEPs are going to expire, what is your suggestion there? Do we still hold those meetings? And then the other question that came through is, and this would pertain to either situation, what happens when a parent rejects a virtual IEP meeting and wants it in person?
Okay, yep. So a couple of things. I'll go first to your first question, which is, what happens if schools are just completely shut down, not planning for things, and you have annual IEP meetings coming up? OSEP did not address this, did not address timelines, extension for timelines. I have not seen anything on DPI's website with respect to extension of timelines. I do know that there is a Ninth Circuit case that was cited by DPI in one of the decisions that I had been part of in terms of an IDEA complaint, where a district held an annual IEP meeting without the parent because the parent couldn't attend the dates the district put out. And DPI specifically went back and cited to that Ninth Circuit decision and said, it is more important to have parent participation than it is to meet the deadline of the annual IEP meeting. When ultimately at the end of the day, the IEP meeting, you should hold off on holding it and wait for parent participation. Does that give me the idea that do you hold those meetings now if this is a time when your school is closed and you're not providing any services? If you can, I don't know. I mean, I guess the answer is I don't know. Here's what my guidance would be. I would hold the IEP meetings virtually if you can for the annual IEP. Even if that annual IEP meeting, and I would encourage you to streamline the process and the meeting in terms of having an agenda, addressing in the meeting that you are meeting to meet the requirement of an annual IEP, that in light of what's happening with COVID and your school district being closed, you are going to have the IEP remain the same, and that you will be reconvening the meeting if and when school opens up. I mean, if there's concern about meeting those dates, hold the meeting virtually. I don't know what you can really do at the meeting in terms of how do you look forward and say, how do we review, revise? What are we going to do in terms of progressing the student through their IEP? Are the services still appropriate? Have you met your goals? So I would say I would give guidance that as of right now, unless there is some guidance that comes out from OSEP or DPI that gives you flexibility in holding those meetings, I would hold those annual IEP meetings and stick to that timeline if you can. The question of what if a parent refuses to do it virtually and comes in, certainly in the OCR document that just came out, that OCR guidance states that you are not required to meet in person while schools are closed. At this point, with Governor Evers, with the restrictions that have been put in place in light of COVID, I think it's reasonable to say we are offering IEP meetings virtually only. One of the things you could do is that you could have a parent come to a district office in a conference room with a computer that's set up for Skyping or a phone, and have the members of the IEP team be virtual, and that parent wants to come in and sit in that conference room, they can if they need that for access, or they want to come into the district. I just don't think at this point you're required to meet with those parents in person while your schools are closed.
Thank you. We've asked everybody to hold questions so that you can finish your presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Okay.
Thanks.
Comp Ed, what are you looking at? Well, as DPI and OSEP have stated, when school resumes, you may have to reconvene the IEP team to determine whether Comp Ed is needed, and if so, the amount. I use the word may because I'm hopeful that there's a little bit of discretion, particularly if schools open up before the end of this school year. I felt like OSEP gave a little bit of leeway, and I don't know if DPI will. But one of the questions obviously was to OSEP, how are we going to schedule IEP meetings to determine Comp Ed for every single one of our students, and when school reopens, in terms of how is this going to go? That seems overwhelming. And what OSEP stated is a couple of things. Number one, document what's being provided and collect data for when school resumes. What does that mean? Collect whatever data you can in terms of how that student is progressing. Is the student able to turn in assignments? Are you seeing them complete assignments, complete work, progress through the curriculum? whatever data you can collect during the period that school is out and either being provided virtually, collect that data so you have it when you're trying to make these decisions. One of the questions was, if school closes for a few weeks, do you need to reconvene all IEP teams? And OSEP stated, well, districts should do at least some individual review to determine which students might need it. So there should be some individual review of all the IEPs and programs to determine what students might need comp ed. Personally, I think if you're talking about schools closing now through the end of the year, I don't know how you don't bring IEP teams back together when schools resume or prior to, the school year resuming, to sit down and meet and determine where the student is at and what services are going to need to be provided in light of all that they had missed. So I think all of this is very dependent on sort of the timelines, but I think it's looking like we're going to be closed to the end of the year. And if that's the case, boy, I don't know how, unless they come out with some guidance that kind of gives you a pass on that, I don't know how you move forward without convening the team to determine that. One of the questions that someone asked is essentially, can comp ed be determined and reflected through the I-10 process, where you just do an amendment to the IEP? Again, and I say the I-10 process, but that's a Wisconsin form, but generally that was the question. And OSEP didn't say yes and they didn't say no. They stated, this is kind of typical, but they did state that district administrators, so special ed directors, case managers, should give guidance to staff regarding how to complete this process. So a district should have a process in place. And I would say not case managers, I would say the special ed directors should have a process in place for how this is going to be handled and follow it. I think at some point, the I-10 may be available again if it's a very short school closing. I think that's going to be a hard thing to do, though, and I would be cautious of that if the school is closing for the rest of the school year and you're coming back to resuming school in the fall. One of the things that OSEP stressed over and over is that comp ed is different than ESY, and that a lot of directors had been confusing the criteria for ESY with comp ed. Personally, I'm not aware of any criteria for comp ed. I wish there were. I think it's one of the biggest issues that happens, particularly after an IDEA complaint decision comes down. And the IDEA complaint decision, I cringe every time when I see the team should reconvene to determine if compensatory education is appropriate and necessary. And I think the IEP team that couldn't agree to begin with is now coming back together to try to determine whether it's necessary or appropriate. I wish there were criteria. I don't think there are, but OSEP continued to say it's not the same as ESY. ESY obviously is based on also not factors that are set forth in any regulations, but have been set by case law and guidance that says recruitment, regression, the Seventh Circuit factors that look at, is there a possibility you're going to lose a skill that you have just acquired or you're almost acquiring it? There's all sorts of factors you look at for ESY. That analysis is OSEP wants to make clear is different than comp ed. So I think that'll have to be fleshed out a bit as we move forward. And that's one of the areas that I've highlighted in terms of what kind of guidance can we give to districts when you start to pull your teams back together in terms of how do we determine what comp ed is necessary. If you're missing school for 2.5 months, there's no way to provide compensatory services that make up for all of those minutes for every student in the district. So we will be working on some guidance for our clients, and I'm hopeful that perhaps DPI and OSEP will be providing some guidance as well. DPI's guidance right now states that LEAs should make every effort to provide compensatory services to make up for the minutes lost, so the student is provided their full educational day. But that guidance came out last week. And the department, it states, though, understands that in some cases this may not be possible. I think it becomes less and less possible as we move toward a longer closure period. So, but again, I don't think there are definitive answers on that. I think we are going to be trying to really craft some guidance for districts and also hoping for perhaps some additional guidance from both the feds and DPI. Services and outside placements. I've gotten this question. If a student's placed outside the district and that placement remains open, does the district need to, or can the district transport the student to that placement? A couple of thoughts. I don't think you need to. And at this point, with the restrictions that are in place, I'd be very cautious and uncomfortable about doing that. One of the first things I would look at is some of the schools where students are placed out. There's some of the placements outside the district that students are placed at are recognized as private schools, and private schools and public schools by the governor's order are ordered to be closed. So I think in some situations you cannot per that order. But I think when you look at it in terms of staff concerns, are you requiring staff to transport a student? Just the exposure to staff, the exposure to students. We held a conference call with agents from the 3 largest school insurers, and those insurers expressed great caution and concern about districts allowing students and transporting students to other placements outside the district, as well as having district staff provide face-to-face instruction with students at different locations. I don't know even where you'd find locations at this point, because most places are closed. So certainly there are insurance issues and liability issues with that. If a student is placed outside the district, one of the questions is will that outside placement continue to provide services virtually, and do they have to, or is it the district's responsibility? Remember, it's like anything else. The district, as the LEA, has the responsibility to ensure FAPE. So if the outside service provider, if that placement, that outside placement is not providing virtual services, you are going to have to determine as the LEA how you do that in terms of your district providing it. Now, what I would suggest as a practical matter is I would be communicating with those outside placements to determine if they have the ability to provide virtual instruction, what that looks like. And what they may be able to or do plan to provide. You might also wish to review your contract with that placement to see if there are any obligations for them in the event of school closures. Obviously, this wasn't anticipated, but the event of other school closures, if they have obligations to provide services to students. That second bullet point, big bullet point, kind of takes me back and just for 1 second, I just want to kind of go off the slide. As you're moving through these questions and this process, in addition to trying to adhere to the requirements of IDEA, I think there is room in all of this to put a very practical perspective and spin on this in terms of, practically speaking, what can we do, what makes sense. In terms of the communicating out with outside placements, you have students in job placements who may be, I know that I spoke to somebody who had a student in a job placement, and that placement was going to continue. Should that student continue to be transported there? I, again, gave guidance. I didn't think so. But in terms of, could that job placement, when you speak with that provider of that transition service or the job placement, can they give you some ideas of things to do with the student virtually that would help the student sort of continue in their ability to gain some life skills, job skills? Talk with those providers, as they are the ones that are providing those. They've got those curriculums and content. But having those conversations and with them and saying, do you have some ideas of what we might do with this student to provide some virtual instruction that would at least keep this going to even a minimal amount, and providing some of these services and instruction that would be consistent with what they were getting at that job site. I mean, obviously they're not going to be able to go somewhere, but certainly can you do something, whether it's over the phone or virtual or written materials or curriculum that you could provide to students kind of in the spirit of what they were getting at those placements. Timelines, oh, a difficult one. OSEP said over and over again in that webinar, we are not going to address timelines in this webinar. We are having internal conversations about this. It is one of our top questions and priorities, and we're going to be issuing guidance in terms of meeting timelines as quickly as we can. Obviously, questions were timelines with respect to evaluations, assessments, development of the IEP, provision of services, annual meetings, all of that. And OSIP specifically stated that it's coming. Conversely, Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, OCR, did provide a little bit more specific guidance. And I will feel more comfortable with this guidance, I should say, once I see if OSEP actually has the same guidance. But then the Office for Civil Rights fact sheet, and that resource is on that first page, they state that if an evaluation under an idea of a student with a disability requires a face-to-face assessment or observation, the evaluation would need to be delayed until school reopens. Evaluations and reevaluations that don't require face-to-face assessments or observations may take place while schools are closed, as long as the parent or legal guardian consents. And the same principles apply to similar activities conducted by personnel with students who have are being evaluated under Section 504 eligibility. So certainly in terms of the face-to-face assessments or observations, OCR takes the position that they are not required and while school is closed and may have to be delayed until school reopens. Again, at this point, if an evaluation is not going to occur, and you are in the midst of a parent has made a referral, or you are in the process of evaluating for SLD, what I would be doing is providing those parents prior written notice that you cannot continue the assessment or evaluation for these following reasons, and provide the reasons in there and provide that notice to the parent. So it's documented and the parent has notice of it. Before you come to that conclusion, some thoughts, some considerations in terms of, okay, should we be considering whether we can do evaluations virtually? Well, can you make a determination with a virtual assessment or an observation? Can you observe a student via Zoom? Is review of existing data, is that enough? In the end, even if you have to delay an evaluation and you know a student has challenges in terms of perhaps its executive functioning, reading, comprehension, math skills, can you, in the interim, before you're calling your team back together and completing that evaluation, can you provide general education interventions virtually until that can be completed? Can you use your EAs or other staff that obviously many of you are looking to continue having them work? Can you use them to do virtual check-ins with students, telephone calls, to do, a couple times a week for 30 minutes, assisting them with homework or reading or math facts or other types of instruction? So can you use those interventions, even though they may not be special education direct instruction? Can you be using those interventions to help a student continue to progress? I'd be considering those things as you are looking at continuing evaluations or providing services, or have students that are in the middle of it and have challenges and difficulties. Can you use some of your general ed interventions and provide those? Related services, obviously all of the guidance that has come out has recognized some related services just aren't going to be able to be provided because they can't be provided at a different location, they can't be provided face-to-face, and they can't be provided virtually right now. Maybe you have related services that can be modified and provided virtually. Telespeech, DPI has guidance on providing telespeech. There are certainly service providers out there. I know in some small districts we've set that up so that when there isn't a speech and language provider, the student receives those services virtually. If you can't, and I also know that there are related service providers that have restrictions with respect to providing virtual instruction. And certainly you need to meet those. But even if you can't provide those services virtually, one of the things OSEP talks about and the guidance talks about is, can you do some parent consultation and provide parents activities to do with their students with respect to OT, PT, maybe even speech. So can you provide those activities to parents so that those students can continue to at least engage in some of those activities during the time that school is closed? I think parent consultation is a real option, particularly because I think a lot of parents are home. And so can you do, check-ins once a week? Can you do telephone calls and say, start working on this, or what are you seeing? Perhaps we can provide you some general activities. If it's possible, continue to collect data on the student for comp ed analysis at the end of the day. That's a tough one, I think. How do you collect data other than really conversations with parents and documenting those conversations and talking to parents, looking to see what students are doing? Are they completing assignments? Are they progressing? It's just going to be a lot of sort of review of what you are seeing from student to student. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Obviously, they have guidance on virtual instruction, DPI does, and the kind of the cautions in terms of what you can provide virtually, and making sure, as Dan, you talked about, even with the meetings, do they comply with FERPA and HIPAA as far as the provision of those services? What if a parent chooses not to access virtual instruction? I know that was one of the questions that came up. That was a question that OSEP got in the webinar, and they stated that if a parent says, I can't, we aren't going to access, we can't do this, we're not going to have my student try to figure out this virtual instruction, they're never going to be able to do it. What they suggested is kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, can we provide an alternate method? Is there a way to provide this in a different way? Can we provide perhaps some written curriculum or materials or activities that a parent can work on, or that we could work on with a student in a telephone call? Is there a way to look at it a little differently? Maybe there's not, but perhaps with a parent who says, I can't have my kid logging onto the computer, they're not going to be able to do it. Is there something else you can provide to that parent in a different way of providing it? If not, and you are offering what you can provide right now, and the parent chooses not to access it, the district, OSEP has said, has met its obligation. What I would do, again, I go back to that prior written notice, I would document that the parent, your offer, what you've offered, any modifications to your offer, and I would document that in a prior written notice, and I would be providing that to the parent following that refusal. So the key elements in terms of moving forward, I'm just going to take a look at my time here, kind of looking at all of this together, and as I said, there will be more guidance coming out, additional questions. You talked about FERPA and HIPAA. I'm going to go back and look at those a little bit more, and I'll provide some information to CESA too. You've asked questions about timelines. Certainly, we're going to go back and hopefully get some more guidance on that. Asking questions about what does comp ed look like? How do we know? Again, going back and hopefully being able to provide some guidance. So please don't think that this is comprehensive. Because it has just been, trying to keep up and trying to put this out for districts to give them some guidance right now. But here's what I will say. I think one of the keys is, and I was concerned about districts moving so quickly to provide virtual instruction. I know in my own district, it's starting right away in Verona, but the concern I have is that once you start down a process, now going back and taking it back or changing it and continually modifying it, I think really can cause some real difficulties as you are resuming school, as you're trying to figure out what's provided to one versus what's provided to the other. My biggest piece of guidance would be, I would be sitting down as a special education team and saying, okay, what is the process we are going to use? What is our internal process, and what is the process we're going to communicate with parents? reviewing IEPs as part of it, determining what virtual services you think you may be able to provide. And I think thinking outside the box is important. I think to the extent you can make good faith efforts to be providing services, even written curriculum, or even parent consultation, I think you will find that you will be ahead of districts that don't do that. Also, determining what your virtual services are and what's available, ensuring you know what your regular ed teachers are doing. In our district, the teachers each are doing something a little different, and I think it's probably the case in a lot of districts. I see that could be a little bit challenging. Some teachers are requiring students to be logged on for particular amounts of minutes. Other teachers are essentially putting on Canvas or the student management system the entire curriculum for the rest of the year and saying, go at it at your own pace. Here are all of the assignments are listed on there, and I'm available at this period of time if you have questions. So determining the virtual services, know what your school is being provided, and kind of included in that process of sitting down and talking about and having a good idea of what you're going to be able to provide to special ed students. Determining whether IEP meetings should be held initially. Determining whether evaluations and assessments can continue. If they can't, making sure that you have a process for documenting why and sending that out. Considering perhaps how to provide gen ed interventions virtually, like we talked about. Evaluating the provision of related services. As I said, I think you're going to find that as time is moving forward here, you are going to have more options as to what you can provide. I think you're going to see companies coming out with more. Ensuring consistent documentation of parent contacts, data collection, provision of services that can't be provided. Document, but make sure that documentation is within one streamlined process. There's got to be a central repository for this, so that documentation is consistent, and it is kept and maintained in the same way. Continue for now, I would say, your annual IEP meeting timelines and provide those meetings virtually. Again, I would streamline those meetings. I would be providing an agenda, letting parents know what you're going to be talking about. And essentially, I think a lot of those meetings are going to ultimately result in, we're holding this meeting because we have to hold an annual IEP meeting. At this point, we have school closed. We don't know what comes in the future. Here are the services we're going to be provided, and we'll reconvene once school resumes.
I'm going to ask a question now, because one of the questions that came through the chat specifically is around annual IEP meetings now. If they're writing annual IEP meetings right now, are they writing them as if the kids were in school, or are they writing them as if it's going to be virtual?
No, I would say, and you're saying if you're writing annual IEP meetings, you mean if you're writing your annual IEP?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. I mean, unless there's different guidance that comes out, in my mind right now, I would not be revising the IEP itself as a result of that annual IEP meeting. That doesn't mean I wouldn't be determining with the parent and in that meeting what services are going to be provided virtually. I would be attaching to the IEP the prior written notice that says schools closed per the order of Governor Evers. These are the services we're going to be providing in the meantime, and we will be reconvening and reviewing annual goals and looking forward once school resumes.
Okay, thank you.
So carefully considering and developing your own internal process. It may be that you are providing very minimal services this week if you're open and you're providing virtual instruction. I would be less concerned about that than I would be about having a piecemeal process that you are addressing one question here and one question there and trying to deal with this parent because they're a squeaky wheel and another parent here. I would be taking some time to determine and develop your process right now. Then I would be also making sure that you are providing clear communication with parents. I would be explaining to parents, this is a fluid process that's changing day to day. that you are working to provide some provision of services, and that over the next week and over probably the next several weeks, you're going to be considering and determining how perhaps you might provide additional services or additional support. And also just making very clear that in some instances, it just may not be possible, and that you are going to be looking once school resumes to determine how to provide those services again, where the student is and what might be needed. I've had this discussion now with a number of different attorneys as far as raising comp ed with parents and just saying, look, parents, we're not going to provide services, but we'll resume and determine what comp ed you need, your student needs, once school reconvenes. I'm nervous about giving that message. And I will say why is because while I absolutely believe you all need to be prepared to be convening teams, IEP teams, and determining compensatory education, I don't think it's a good message right off the bat to send to parents that say you are going to be entitled to comp ed once school resumes, because you may have students who are able to progress, who are able to move toward their IEP goals, who don't have a lot of services in their IEP. You may also have some leeway given to you by that time, by DPI, by OSEP, that gives you the ability to, to kind of take a different look at things. And so at this point, while I would tell you as service providers and as the district individuals that yes, I think you're going to be providing comp ed and at least looking at what you have to provide. But my communication with parents now would be, right now, this is what we are providing. This is what we can't provide. Here's the process. Here's how we're going to be doing it. Please know that this is likely to change and that we will be looking at convening IEP teams when necessary in the future and taking additional steps. I would set up frequent check-in with parents as schools continue to be closed. The one thing that I would encourage is that you make very clear with staff and with your providers that this is not a sort of out of sight, out of mind. I would be making your best efforts and even setting a schedule where you are checking back in with parents to see where students are at. Are they able to complete assignments? Are they able to get instruction? Do you need to tweak things a little bit to help them in terms of accessing the instruction and being able to kind of continue in the general ed curriculum? If students aren't participating, and I know this one is tough because I think some districts, as I'm aware of and hearing from others, is that there aren't really any things being turned in, attendance isn't being taken. But if you are a district where you know you're going to know whether a student is or isn't participating, I would be checking in if they're not participating. I also would just make it a practice to be checking in with parents of your special ed students on at least some basis to find out where they're at so that you have an idea of where that student is. I would continue investigating virtual service providers. I'm hopeful that perhaps DPI may be able to work a bit or identify some service providers or online curriculum or content. I know OSEP talked about that there are a number of different companies that are providing free access. And I would closely monitor DPI and DOE's websites and utilize your DPI resources and contacts. I know they're overwhelmed, there's no question about it. But I would, if you've got specific questions, if you're concerned as you're moving forward, I would be at least sending emails. I think they will be addressing them eventually. And so I would encourage you to do that. In terms of providing special ed services, I think outside the box. I mean, I think that's where we're at. As I said, I think companies are providing free access. I'd consider whether you have EAs or other staff that can work virtually with students, even if it's not direct special education instruction, but working with students and providing them support. I would be making staff available during instructional times so parents can seek guidance and seek help if they're sitting with their student doing work or they're not able to access the technology or whatever maybe. I would be giving them some assistance in terms of here who's going to be available. These are the people you can contact during this time. DPI guidance provides some strategies, communication and check-in, assistive technology tools, flexible design instruction, so on and so forth. So a DPI provides a little guidance, but I think that it really is going to come down to you as the sort of educational experts, and I think you are, is, what can you find? How can you work to try to provide some services to these students? Okay, that's it. So do you have questions? I know you do. We all do. So
there are some questions. Are you able to take questions now, or do you want to?
No, I'm fine. I'm at home, so I've got calls and things to make. So I'm trying to work at home and do my part. So I'm happy to stay on as long as people want to ask questions.
Okay, so the first question is regarding virtual instruction and FERPA and HIPAA. If you want to do small group instruction, is that a violation of FERPA and HIPAA? And then to piggyback, can parents sign off on that so that you can continue small group instruction virtually?
Yeah, that is a question now that has come up in the last day here for me. If you're going to be providing small group instruction, the first question, can they? My answer would be I would guess they can, but I will look a little bit more into that question and hopefully provide you some more definitive guidance. I certainly, my suggestion would be, and I think I had the conversation with somebody yesterday, if you're going to be doing small group instruction, I would have parents provide consent in writing to you for consent for their child to be participating in that, and the consent, certainly, I think you could probably modify your sharing of student information consent to say you've consent to your student, the information about your student being shared in the small group setting, and you are consenting to your students' participation in that, and you understand that the participation will involve other students and parents and maybe even other third parties that are in the home that will be part of that small group instruction. So I would include as much information as you can in terms of getting parents' consent so they fully understand what that means. But I will work to provide some more definitive guidance on that.
The next question that we have is around birth to 3 referrals. Do they start them and then issue prior written notice of why we can't continue, or do we just issue notice that we're not even going to start the process this year because of the situation?
Yeah, I would say, to be honest, at this point, I think I would be issuing prior written notice as to why you are not starting the evaluation. But that evaluation is the referral is documented, and that when you have the ability to begin the evaluation, you will begin it. I mean, unless something else comes out or I read something that says something different. I think the guidance from DOE does provide some guidance in there in terms of providing those services when schools are closed, when state agencies are closed. So I would go back to that guidance and just look and see if that has additional information in it. And that's on the resource page of this webinar. It's that first resource.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, if you're not going to be able to complete the evaluation, my suggestion would be is to document that you have received the referral and that it is documented and that you will begin the referral or the evaluation process once you are able to do the evaluation and assessments.
Thank you. The next question is around graduating students. Is it best practice to meet on senior IEPs to talk about compensatory services prior to diplomas being issued?
And I'm not hesitating because I don't know, because I don't have an answer for you. I'm trying to think of kind of rethinking that question a little bit, is in terms of, is it necessary to convene teams to determine what comp ed is necessary? I think comp ed is the idea of, do you need compensatory services to provide the student FAPE to make up for what they didn't get? With the graduating senior, I think the question is, can you provide services to that student now such that, or can you modify can you modify requirements or curriculum such that you can continue, so that the student can continue progressing through the curriculum and meet the graduation requirements. So I don't know that it's a question of compensatory services, I guess is what I'm getting to. I think at this point, yes, a priority certainly would be, the priority certainly would be trying to figure out how you can provide those services, whatever necessary services, instructions to students to allow them to continue toward graduation.
Okay, thank you.
You can look by. I'm sorry, my daughter's just getting up, so I'm just letting her go by. You want to flip by, go ahead.
That's okay. The next question was regarding, again, compensatory services, and this is specific to a district that's completely shut down. And do you have to consider compensatory services if you're completely shut down with no virtual offering?
So, that's an interesting question, and one that did come up on that on the OSEP webinar also. And the question was, if your district is not providing anything for the rest of the school year, say, or for the next month, you're not providing any instruction to any student, do you have to provide comp ed to your students with disabilities? OSEP kind of deflected the question, and I think what they would say, at least from the sort of mushy answer that was given, was that if you're out for a month, regardless of the reason, whether it's that you're just closed because of COVID-19 and you're not providing any services, or because you can't provide virtual instruction, so you're just not providing it across the board. But if you're out for a month, it kind of comes back to, do you have to provide comp ed? Well, when you're coming back after a month, you're going to have to determine where the student is and what's needed to assist the student to continue to progress and toward their goals and through the general ed curriculum. Is it going to be compensatory services? Well, it may require some additional services to help them kind of make up for whatever regression that occurred. I don't know that they would call it comp ed. Maybe they will, I don't know. I think the general idea that I at least got from OSEP was that, look, you're going to have students who are literally going to come to a complete halt because they are students with significant disabilities and they aren't going to be able to participate virtually at all. So even if you aren't providing instruction to your regular education students, those students perhaps are going to need additional services once school resumes, just to bring them back to where, at least where they left off, or to bring them back into being able to progress through the curriculum. I mean, one of the questions that came up, which I thought was so interesting, and I can imagine that this is going to be incredibly difficult, is that you have a lot of students with behavioral issues where transitions are so difficult. And now you are going to have students who are off for a month or two. And the idea, and I would encourage you to do this, and I should have added this to the webinar, the idea of trying to transition and re-enter them all into the school environment at once school resumes. I would be thinking ahead and determining which students you think may really struggle with that, and thinking now through a re-entry and transition plan back to school, because I think that's going to be significant for a lot of students. So what you can do now, sort of to look ahead and to be prepared for that, because on day one when school starts and you have students, all of your students who struggle with transitions from classroom to classroom, now coming into school on the first day, I think is going to be overwhelming. So I think I would encourage you to be thinking about that as well.
We've got two questions that may or may not be related. One around records requests. What do we do when they're not in session? And then what do we do if we get referrals today or received them in the last couple of days?
So I'll go to the records request first. I mean, I think records requests, if your school isn't in session, but your administration and your staff is at school, I think records requests are things that can be reviewed and can be responded to. I mean, I think here's what I would say. I think the timeline for the response might be a little bit more flexible. I mean, there's not a specific timeline anyway. If your parents are asking for their own students' records, you have 45 days, or if with a special ed student, you have to provide it before the next IEP meeting. But public records requests, certainly it's just a reasonable period of time, or as promptly as possible. I think certainly that in terms of a record request, in the next couple of weeks, as things start to slow down a bit, I do think that records requests are something that may be reasonable to respond to parents. Forgot what the second question was.
The second question was around referrals.
Oh, referrals.
If
you get referrals now. That is a hard one. And I hesitate to give a black and white answer on it, because I'm kind of hoping I see stuff come out from the feds and or DPI. I haven't seen anything that says if a referral comes in right now for special education of one of your K through 12 students, you don't have to do anything with it. I think, like everything else, what I would advise right now is taking a look at the referral, determining what is going to be necessary to evaluate the student, and if the evaluation and assessments are going to require face-to-face observations or evaluation or assessments. What I would do is I would respond to the parent with a prior written notice that says this is why we can't provide that evaluation, why we can't start the evaluation, and why we can't assess now, and why we will do that as soon as school resumes, and we can have face-to-face contact with the student. That's the best I have. Do I know that that's the perfect answer? I don't, to be honest with you. I will be scouring things to determine if any guidance does come out. But I would go back to what I had talked about at the beginning, which are sort of the spirit of the law. Is there a way to do the assessment or the evaluation virtually? And if there is, can you do it? And does it make sense to do it now? It may. In looking at the referral, is there a way to, even if you can't complete the evaluation, is there a way to provide some general education interventions that might assist the student and provide support right now? Sorry, my phone. Hold on one second. Is there a way to provide even some general ed interventions right now to provide those students some support if you anticipate that they are students who are really struggling, they are students who may have a specific learning disability? What can you provide right now to assist them, even if you can't complete the evaluation?
And I think this is, unless another one comes through, this is the last question. And this is around students with significant special education needs that the team has determined won't benefit from virtual instruction, but will be receiving ESY. It doesn't seem like they have many options for compensatory services when they return. Are there suggestions around that?
So as far as, keep in mind, Comp Ed, ESY, two different things. OSEP and DPI are focusing heavily on Comp Ed, not necessarily ESY, as that's a different evaluation or criteria. Not to say that that's not also going to be appropriate for students. Students who are not going to benefit from virtual instruction now because of significant disabilities, as far as what's available in terms of Comp Ed. I mean, I think that the fact is when you resume school and you come back, to doing, the first step I think would be doing really comprehensive assessment as to where the student is at and what they've lost, and where, kind of where they are in terms of your assessment. I think that's the first step. Without that information, I don't know how you determine what they need. So if it's a student with really significant disabilities, have they lost even those life skills that they had gained in terms of their instruction? And Comp Ed, I think it may be may look like ESY in the summer. Perhaps it's providing instruction in the summer. Perhaps it's providing more direct instruction in some of those services during the following school year. I don't know. I think it's all sort of unclear, and maybe there will be other opportunities in terms of compensatory education as far as what might be able to be provided, what DPI and services and resources they may have. But I don't think there's a perfectly clear answer on that. I do think that, even though OSEP says ESY is different than Comp Ed, I think you're going to have a lot of students where you really are looking at providing services over the summer, whether it's technically through the ESY, which I guess it would be, or whether it's through compensatory education, providing those services over the summer to get kids back up so that they're ready to start the school year in the fall.
Okay, no other questions has come through at this point.
And Tracy, I'm happy if questions come up and you get them from members, I'm happy to try to address them.
Okay, thank you.
Webinar. And as I said, the areas that I heard that you need more guidance on are the HIPAA and FERPA questions, the evaluations that are coming in right now, annual IEPs, and kind of those are the overall timeline questions. And hopefully that information will come out. I'll provide it to you when it does. And it may be that as we dig a little bit further here, we will come up with some guidance, some different guidance on it as well. So I would just say, we're working on it. So just please know that it just seems to be changing frequently, but I would go back again and again to sort of the intent of the law. And I would use your best efforts to provide what you can and try to provide services and try to meet deadlines. And when you can't, I would document it and the reasons why. But I think the effort will go a long way at the end of the day.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tess.
You're welcome. Thanks very much, everybody.
Yep, thank you, everyone. And we'll get that this recording posted on our website, and we'll send it out to all superintendents and directors of pupil services that this original email came to. So you have a couple different ways of accessing the recording and presentation. Thanks, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Good luck with all your planning and next steps. It's a moving target.
Yep. Thank you.